Sorcha, you were in Tanzania with Oxfam last week. Can you tell us why you went there, how you got on, and could you tell us about what your thoughts are and what you saw there now that you are back?
Well, the reason I went to Tanzania last week was to see the work that Oxfam is doing to support refugees who've arrived over the past year from Burundi. So since about May or so of last year, April, May, about 130,000 people have crossed from Burundi into Tanzania due to, I suppose, escalating tensions within Burundi itself. And a lot of them, the vast majority of them would have come in, the tens of thousands in the very early months of this response, in early summer 2015. And a lot of them would have had to gather on a small beach on Lake Tanganyika. So thousands of people were gathering there with, very little water and food and other support. And eventually they were ferried or bused to refugee camps within Tanzania. I suppose what's interesting about this particular refugee crisis is that, firstly, it's, I suppose, totally off the radar, and that most people in Ireland won't be aware that, Tanzania, which is somewhere people think of in terms of climbing Mount Kilimanjaro or going to Serengeti, etc., safaris, that there's actually a big refugee emergency response going on there. And also a lot of the people who've arrived in Tanzania over the past year from Burundi, it's not their first time being a refugee. For some, it's their second or third time. They would have come to Tanzania before in the late 90s, and I think in the early 80s as well, some of them. So Tanzania is a country which has been very welcoming to refugees. Last year, one of the kind of pictures that did the rounds on social media in Tanzania was a picture of two Maasai tribesmen holding up a sign saying refugees are welcome to Tanzania. And so the government there, along with aid agencies like Oxfam, is doing a lot of work in camps to try and help people who've just arrived. So what I was seeing there was water and sanitation work that Oxfam is doing. I saw also work that we're doing with children to help them to spread messages about how to stay healthy and prevent waterborne diseases. So I watched a lot of really brilliant performances by groups of children, musical performances and drama performances where they were teaching other kids about how to wash hands and how to stay safe from diseases. And then also another big part of our work in the camps is helping people to develop livelihoods. So I suppose one of the biggest things that happens to refugees is they arrive somewhere and they've been through obviously a very traumatic time and a difficult journey. And then it's very hard for people when they can't earn a living. They're not allowed to leave the camps. So, and, a lot of them don't have any resources to try and set up businesses within the camps. So what we're trying to do is to help people, give them a bit of support so they can develop a way to make a living, so they can earn some extra income that can help them to buy things like, vegetables and other food that will supplement the kind of aid that they're getting. So an example of that was a tailor's workshop that we went to visit, where 25 tailors are working together and making these beautiful clothes. And we helped them to get a building and to get the sewing machines together, but now it's over to them and they're doing really well and they're selling their clothes within the camp, and hopefully that group will be expanding as time goes on. We also visited a soap making workshop where refugees are making soaps, and there's other work like that, bakery and so on.
You mentioned there a few things. You mentioned sanitation. One of the first things you mentioned is when the camp you were in, or camps, was there sanitation there?
Yes, what Oxfam has done is built latrines or toilets. So they're kind of like, pit toilets. And at the moment we have one latrine for every 4 households. What we're trying to do is build even more so that there's even more access to toilets. So that's obviously really important, that people have somewhere that's clean and safe to use the bathroom. And also beside the latrines, which are kind of these like private kind of huts so people can have the privacy, we also have what we call the tippy tap, which is this really clever system where you've got these 2 You've got these a structure made out of sticks of wood, and hanging off the top bar are two water containers. One has soapy water in it and one has clear water in it. So what you do is you put your foot onto kind of a lever, and soapy water comes out, and then you put your foot on the other lever and clear water comes out, so you can wash your hands without having to touch anything. Because a big thing, and I suppose a big way that disease can spread is when people are putting their hands on taps and other things, and so that's a big part of our work there, as it is around the world. And then also we're doing a lot of work in terms of pumping water and making water clean. So I went to see a river there where we were taking water and chlorinating it to make it safe for people to drink.
Just one more question on Tanzania specifically, and then we can talk about the refugee crisis in general. We're talking about sanitation again. Like I read, and I've heard that in a lot of places, say around the world, where they're bringing in sanitation, that the local people have never had toilets before, and a lot of them are afraid to use them. Did you have a problem, or did you have to educate the people there about them, or were they already used to them, or what's the story?
I think I don't think it was a particular issue in this crisis, but we have been working with children to make sure that they understand the need to wash their hands and all that. We've also built child-friendly toilets, so that because pit latrines, which are basically a hole in the ground and then kind of a strong structure around the hole, so that it can withstand the force of someone crouching over it. We've built child-friendly versions of them so that children aren't kind of intimidated or afraid to use those particular types of toilets. So, but what we do in this camp is, along with the hygiene promotion work that we do with children, in terms of helping them to, I guess, learn these messages through song and dance and drama, is that we also have volunteers, like adult volunteers, who are working as community hygiene promoters as well. So they're making sure that households are, for example, filling up the tippy tap water tanks with clean water and soapy water and so on and so on. So it's a big part of our work in terms of trying to prevent the spread of diseases like cholera and so on, that we try and remind people of how, especially in kind of cramped conditions like refugee camps, that diseases can spread very, very easily.
Tanzania is just one country out of several with a refugee crisis. Can you tell me what is the big latest news regarding the overall refugee crisis, for example, Syria, Gaza or whatever, and with your experience of being in Tanzania last week, can you tell us how the refugee crisis in the EU compares with the refugee crisis in some other countries, like outside of the EU, like Tanzania?
I suppose in terms of what's the most recent developments in terms of the crisis, looking at the global picture, is that in June the UN's Refugee Agency published its annual statistics, which showed that the number of people displaced around the world is now 65 million, which is the highest level since the Second World War. So again, we see that the numbers of people on the move are continuing to rise every year. And I suppose there's been a lot of talk as well about how the EU-Turkey deal is affecting people arriving in Europe. And then also, the story of Syria and Syrian refugees continues to dominate. But I suppose another aspect to the refugee crisis is the situation of people who are displaced in countries like Yemen, which we don't really tend to hear about much in the news, or again, the people who've been displaced over a very long period of time in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I suppose trying to compare the situation, say, in Europe to, say, for example, developing countries like Tanzania, I think what people can forget sometimes is the fact that it's really developing countries that are actually hosting the vast majority of refugees. 86% of those who are displaced worldwide are actually in a developing or a poor country. And really the numbers that have been coming to Europe represent such a tiny fraction of those, of the global picture. And I think sometimes when we talk about the word crisis, refugee crisis in Europe, I think really it's actually just a small percentage of what is really actually a genuine global crisis. And I think that's why it's so important to continue supporting work in countries like Tanzania, where the vast majority of people are coming. And I think another contrast as well is the welcome that Tanzania has given to refugees, despite having, its own problems as a developing country. It's really incredible to see that, refugees are able to cross the border, with no issues. They're not turned back. Their human right to refuge is respected, and the Tanzanian government has played a very important role in terms of trying to help with this emergency response and set up the kind of the camps and structures and so on that allow people to live in peace and safety.
You mentioned there Yemen and the Congo, and we've talked about Tunisia and Tanzania, and there's like Palestine as well. If the conflict is still going on, or it's starting again in South Sudan, isn't it? And are there any other countries in conflict that we should kind of know about?
Yeah, I suppose the situation in South Sudan is another one of those chronic crises. Yes, yeah. I suppose I just say about South Sudan is that it's been 5 years now since
you were over there, weren't you?
Yes, I was in South Sudan 2 years ago, and it was a very grim situation. I visited a camp called Malakal which is I think in the kind of the north centre of the country, and people were living in really difficult conditions, extremely cramped. It was the ground in which people's tents were on was so muddy that people were kind of walking and knee deep in mud in some places.
Was it muddy inside the tents as well?
Very muddy, yes. Yeah, and some people were, kind of just like hopping onto beds and things like that because everything else was just to stay safe in the mud. And there's children running around in the mud, and there was you could see that there was human feces and things like that, and urine, going into the same mud. So it was a really dangerous and difficult situation there, and in terms of health. And unfortunately, there was a rise in tensions, in recent times in South Sudan. So it's still a very difficult time for people there.
We don't have to go into depth in any more countries, but are there any other conflicts that are causing a lot of refugees, or have we gone through them all? Do you know?
I suppose the Syria conflict is obviously the main contributing factor.
I remember interviewing you last year when you said that 2015 was a major crisis year for humanitarian crises. We are now in the middle of 2016, and would it be accurate to say that this year, 2016, is actually worse for humanitarian crises in comparison to last year? And on top of that, could you just tell us what is your message to our listeners, please?
Yeah, I suppose 2015 was a really very difficult year in terms of people on the move, in terms of global displacement, which was continued to rise last year. And I suppose also there was quite a few natural disasters, and this was the most serious, I suppose, of all of those natural disasters was the Nepal earthquake. So I suppose 2015 was a very big year in terms of humanitarian responses, and a lot of agencies and governments were really overstretched trying to support people in all those scenarios. And I think in 2016 we've seen with the rise in people who have become refugees and global displacement and protracted conflicts continuing, that it is again another very difficult year in terms of humanitarian work, it's certainly, I suppose we're in July now, and there hasn't been maybe the same level of natural disasters, but we also see continuing concern about the El Nino phenomenon, which is causing drought and other difficulties for people all around the world, for example, in countries in Africa, but also in South America. So it seems that the humanitarian system is very much under pressure. And what's happening in September, which it is of interest in terms of the refugee question is that there will be two major summits in New York, one by the UN and one by the US President Barack Obama, to try and help resolve some of the issues that are involved in the refugee crisis globally. But certainly there's a huge volume of humanitarian work taking place, and a lot of agencies are, struggling to try and keep all their programs going. And so I suppose the message from Oxfam would be, that we are really grateful for the public support we're getting for our humanitarian work, and that we're also, in conjunction with providing aid, also campaigning and advocating for long-term solutions to some of these crises, whether it's, applying political pressure for peace talks in certain countries, but also we have a particular campaign at the moment called Right to Refuge, where we're encouraging people to help put pressure on the Irish government in the run-up to these UN summits in New York to make sure that everything that is being done to protect the human rights of people on the move is being done and will be respected.